Committee will come to order, please. If you have your speaker on your laptop, please turn it off. It echoes. First order of business today is bill introductions. Are there any bill introductions? I can't see the other folks. Is this working? Seeing none. Next order of business is we have an informational hearing this morning from the Division of Conservation Kansas Corporation Commission and the Director, Ryan Hoffman. Mr. Hoffman, welcome to the committee.
Mr. Chair, thank you for having me. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you, and hopefully this works. It's my first time ever sharing using WebEx, so I know I keep hearing all the time about how this is a process. Will you indicate for me if you can see that or not?
Not yet.
Okay. All right, so can you see the PowerPoint now? Is the presentation up?
It is. Thank you.
All right. Well, sorry for that. First and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to talk about our division today. I am Ryan Hoffman. I'm the Director of the Conservation Division of the Kansas Corporation Commission. And you're all probably very familiar with the KCC and know that the KCC has 3 commissioners who are in charge, and no more than 2 can be from the same political party. There are technically 5 divisions within the Corporation Commission. The 4 of them are in Topeka, and I won't talk about these other than just to mention them here. But the Utilities Division, Transportation, which is motor carriers, and then Energy and Administration are all housed in our Topeka office there. And then by statute, the Conservation Division is to be housed here in Wichita, and that is 74,606. And then 74,623 gives the Conservation Division the exclusive jurisdiction to regulate oil and gas activities, except for refining, transportation, and then storage after the transportation. And we do have a mission that is on our website. This is on this slide is verbatim what is on our website, and you can see that it's to protect correlative rights and environmental resources. We do that by preventing waste and enforcing our regulations that provide for producing the resources efficiently. Statutorily, prevention of waste and is defined several ways in Kansas. And I say that, and there's one definition statute for each oil and gas, but they go into great detail as to the different ways that waste is defined. But it's the primary basis for conservation acts. If you've ever seen those pictures of the early times in the industry where oil would just be sitting in earthen berms on the side of the road somewhere, that's one of the reasons why we have the conservation acts. And then the protection of correlative rights is also a major statutory mandate. And what that really boils down to is that everyone who is producing from their, or everybody has a right, I should say, to their fair share of the minerals under their property. And For the first two here, prevention of waste and protection of correlative rights, the way that the commission has historically handled these matters is through spacing regulations, well spacing regulations, and then also production allowables. Production allowables aren't as much of an issue anymore because the nature of the industry in Kansas is very mature, and most wells aren't able to make that initial production minimum. The least known statutory mandate, I would say, is probably the protection of usable water. And it's a major consideration for all of our well construction, well testing, and well plugging regulations. It's also the primary reason why we have established sensitive groundwater areas for the drilling pits that are associated with wells. And I talk about usable water, and I want to make sure and know that that's not just pollution of that water, it's also the loss of that water through downward drainage. And when we talk about usable water, we're not talking about anything that you'd want to drink or at least serve to anybody that you like. It's got at least 10,000 milligrams of total dissolved solids per liter, which means that it's usable in the sense that it can generally be cleaned up and used for another purpose, but it's definitely not what you or I would consider to be fresh or drinking water. We also have are statutorily required to have a group, this advisory committee, to help us advise us on our regulations. And it's a 12-member committee. The chair of the committee is the commission's representative, and I am the chair of the Oil and Gas Advisory Committee. But as you can see here, we have members from DWR, the Eastern Kansas Oil and Gas Association. We have a royalty owner member. We have a representative from the Groundwater Management Districts, KDHE. The Farm Bureau and Livestock and Kansas Livestock Association have a member who is a surface owner. And then KGS has a member, Cuyahoga has a member, the Kansas Petroleum Council, the Kansas Water Office, and then there's a public member who is appointed by the governor. So that committee meets at least quarterly, and I will talk about some of the things that committee has on its plate this coming year. Before I do that, though, I'll talk about how the conservation itself is specifically structured. And what you can see here with this state of Kansas map with the golden or orange counties is that each one of those colored counties had at least some sale of oil or natural gas for 2020. So you can see how widespread oil and gas production is in Kansas. And that helps justify why we have offices throughout the states. Within our central office, there are 5 departments, and I'll talk about each one of those more in depth as we go forward. The other part of this is that I mentioned there's an administrative staff in Topeka. Well, we do have 2 IT staff that report to the IT department in Topeka, but they are dedicated to conservation, so they are based out of our central office in Wichita. And then we also have a pipeline safety inspector who has an office in our building, although he reports directly to Topeka. The department that I belong to is the Administrative Services Department, and it's what you could expect for administrative services. It's the business functions of our division, and that's fiscal, human resources, public affairs, and IT. One of the lesser known functions and one that is actually fairly time consuming is the administrative functions of abandoned well plugging. That means all the invoices, checking prices, putting projects out for bid, those types of things all come through our administrative department. We also help coordinate activities between our district offices. And then, like today, we participate in the legislative process either by giving presentations or testimony and helping with fiscal notes. Within the central office, we also have a customer support division. And that's really 2 employees who assist our staff in the industry in the use of certain digital media. And when I'm talking about digital media, I'm talking about our online automated reporting system, or COLR. As you can see here, we have a wide variety of forms that are required to be filed online. COLR is programmed and maintained by the Kansas Geological Survey, and then we have staff who essentially helps test it and then can report and be that go-to person between KGS and our staff, and then, of course, for the industry who uses it. The bottom form there, the casing mechanical integrity test, the U7, that's the most recent addition to COLR, and that is the tests that we run on injection wells. one of the newer things about Kohler that is also very beneficial is this operator management module concept. And what that is it's a one-stop shop essentially for any operator. Once they log into their Kohler account, they can look and see, do they have any wells with future requirements? Meaning, do they have any deadlines coming up? Do they have a test or a form due, something that needs to be submitted? They can find it there. But even maybe more important to them is, do you have any wells out of compliance? And you can then separate and see what is out of compliance and what needs to be done. And you can even click on the link to go take care of that. If you have a form that's due or overdue, you can click the link and follow to go get that filed. I mentioned the other digital media. It's RBDMS, or Risk-Based Data Management System. It's our well database, and we got it in the 1990s. It was installed by AALL Consulting with the help of the Groundwater Protection Council, or GWPC. And you'll hear me talk about GWPC quite a bit today. But this database was originally designed for UIC wells, but it has since expanded to include everything. The sources for the data that went into our RBDMS, this access database, came from 6 different places, and they're all listed here on this slide. At the time of the creation of this database, the idea was to get all of the data into it and then to clean it up as we went forward. And I can tell you that as of right now, we are still at a point where we have about 12,000 records that we're trying to reconcile. But the good news is that it's down to 12,000 records, and we verified over 100,000 well records. One of the primary ways we did that was using our Environmental Protection and Remediation Department and the well inventory project. That took over 5 years for them to go through, but essentially what it was that when an operator files their license, they would file a well inventory with us. We would review that, go over our records, go over anything else, public records that we could find, verify that all the wells that were supposed to be accounted for on that lease were accounted for. And so now, instead of submitting a well inventory, operators either certify their well inventory, and that's how when they renew their license. They also process transfers of wells between operators. They manage our spill database, and they are our liaison with the Department of Emergency Management for their Web EOC, which is a statewide master spill database. They process PIT applications and extensions, and I mentioned the sensitive groundwater areas before. That's what we're talking about. They'll look to see if where the operator wants to put the PIT is within one of those sensitive groundwater areas. If there's any questions, they will reach out to our district staff, have our district staff go do a site inspection prior to issuing that permit. And then depending upon where the pit is located, they'll get specific construction requirements or be told they can't have a pit there because the area is too sensitive. They also help review environmental assessments and projects for grants at other agencies to see if there's any sort of overlap or potential issue with any of our items. We have a legal department, and I have litigation with a question mark here for a specific reason, and that is we typically pre-COVID would only have one hearing per month, or one hearing day per month, I should say. So there wasn't always a lot of litigation. We like to think of our attorneys more as in-house counsel, in that they're here to answer questions and provide regulatory guidance to our staff on all types of matters, big or small. It can range from how best to proceed in a certain situation to language in a letter, but then it can get into bigger issues in terms of actual how a legal interpretation impacts current policies. They do represent our staff and the public generally in hearings before the commission. They assist with the drafting and amendment of regulations. And then within our legal department is a licensing position, and that our license department reviews all the applications to make sure that operators have met the statutory requirements before they can either have a new license or have their current license renewed. For the production and UIC department is really all about wells, and it's how wells are constructed, how they're used, and how they're plugged. We have two separate kind of branches here. And the production branch is the one that issues the intents to drill or permits to drill. They look at well completion reports to make sure wells were completed properly, and they review and grant plugging applications. They also are our technical expert for non-routine items, such as well location exceptions, new pools, horizontal wells, or unit applications. And sometimes this requires them to be a technical expert at a hearing. The underground injection control, or UIC branch of this department is all about injection wells. And we were granted primacy over Class 2 injection wells from the EPA in 1984. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there are 6 classes of injection wells. Class 2 applies specifically to oil and gas production and exploration. Kansas is 3rd in the nation in terms of UIC wells. We are behind Texas and California. And there are 2 types of UIC wells. Some people refer to them as injection or enhanced oil recovery, and we call them EOR. They are the wells that are used to put fluid back into the formation that it came out of, usually a water flood. And then if you think about the other type of injection well, it's a disposal well. And that's where the wastewater has been separated from the hydrocarbon, and it's put down into another formation where it won't impact production. I do note here that we went through a GWPC peer review, and if you recall, that's the Groundwater Protection Council. I'll get into a lot more detail here in the following slides about what that entailed. We first had our program reviewed in 1990, so just 6 years after we were granted primacy was the first time it was reviewed. And then in April of 2019, at the Groundwater Protection Council Board of Directors meeting, the staff there was giving a presentation on the progress of the state reviews, the peer reviews. And they mentioned how it had been a while for a lot of states. And I guess I was just sitting in the right spot, because they looked at me and said, "Hey, Ryan, we haven't been to Kansas in a long time. Would you mind if we come, review your program?" And I think my willingness sort of surprised them, because this is a lot of work. And but I knew that it had been a long time, and it was something that I viewed as worthwhile. So in July of 2019, they sent us a questionnaire. We filled it out and sent it back. And then in September of 2019, they came to our office for 3 days, and we sat down and went through our entire program with them. And the review team had Groundwater Protection Council staff, a regulator from Ohio, a regulator from Oklahoma, and then a retired EPA staff member leading the review. And then we were observed by the Environmental Defense Fund and by current Region 7 staff. Really, it was a full staff effort to participate in this. It was our UIC staff, our production staff, legal, Kohler, and district. So there were quite a few people who contributed to this final product. And I have a link there in your information you can click on to go read the final report. It is available on their website. And I'll go into just kind of some of the executive summary of what they found. First and foremost, we'll talk about strengths, because I think that's the way they put it, so it's probably the best way to go. They talked about really our use of our staff to make sure that we were covering critical operations was really commendable. They touted our staff's knowledge and technical competency. And again, they said even use of our field staff to make sure that the most critical program elements were witnessed was something they commended. They gave us high marks for the changes we have made to our UIC regulations to help enhance our program. And this one may seem sort of out of place, but really it's extremely important. And I'll talk in depth about what we've done with our abandoned well plugging efforts, but they commended us for what we have done over the past 3 years to change the way we plug abandoned wells. And unlike any review, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. They did have suggestions. The first one is that we need to do something about our financial assurance. And they list three opportunities for us to review and things to think about. And I can tell the committee that I already teed this up for the advisory committee and said we will be reviewing financial assurance. And we'll likely have to come back for a statutory change for that at some point in the future. But that is something that we look to try and work through in 2021. They also suggested that we update our COLR system or continue to work on our COLR system so that more UIC activities could be included, and our RBDMS or our well database. I can tell the committee that for COLR, I mentioned we did get the test form in there. We already had our reporting in there, and through our MOU with KGS, we're looking at adding the permit application to COLR this next fiscal year. So we're right on task for those. The field inspections would be something that goes into RBDMS, and we met with Groundwater Protection Council and a consultant about how we can upgrade our system. The unfortunate part of this is that we're not North Dakota or Texas or sitting on a major resource where we could look at a multi tens of millions of dollar computer upgrade. But the parties we work with understand that, and they're looking at designing a solution that would make our old access database more user-friendly on the front end, so that it can do some of these things that some of the higher price tag items can do without maybe having necessarily all of the bells and whistles. The next bullet is something they recommend in every review, and that's just that we have a cement bond log, or even if possible to have a variable density log as well run on all new or newly converted Class 2 wells. That's a matter for Oil and Gas Advisory to take up. And the last bullet is they wanted us to continue to work with KGS and KDHE for acquiring seismic data in case any of it is held confidentially. And really, I think for the most part, in recent history, we've had a pretty good working relationship with both KDHE and KGS, and I think the relationships are actually improving. Moving out of the central office, we have 4 districts throughout the state, and you can see them highlighted here. I'll talk about some of the details for each of them specifically to show you how they're unique and what makes them different. But just generically, each district has a geologist supervisor, a professional geologist supervisor, who's in charge of essentially running the district. And then for them, they have a professional geologist who oversees remediation efforts. Then they have a staff of environmental compliance and regulatory specialists. These are our field inspectors. And then each district office has at least one administrative support staff. District 1 is headquartered in Dodge City. It has 27 counties in southwest Kansas. As you can see, the types and numbers of wells, they have a total of 25,886 wells, and I have an asterisk there because I didn't include every type of well. There are water supply wells or cathodic boreholes. If you were to ask somebody else, they may come up with a different number, but I focused on oil wells, gas wells, and then in UIC wells. And you can see here that District 1 has the largest number of gas wells, and for those of you familiar with the area and know about the Hugon and Sonoma Council Grove formations, you know that that is the reason why there are more gas wells in southwest Kansas than there are anywhere else. District 2 is kind of the central swath of Kansas from Oklahoma to Nebraska. It's also 27 counties. About half as many wells as District 1. If you recall from that earlier map showing where production was in Kansas, you know the northern tier of counties here don't have oil and gas production. But the primary resource here is oil. And then District 3 is eastern Kansas, and there are 32 counties in District 3. And you can look and see the number of wells here far exceeds any other district and is just about the same as all 3 other districts combined. The reason for that is the resources in this part of the state are shallower, and they don't have the same reservoir pressure that you would find as you go west. So you need more wells that are closer spaced to bring that oil to the surface. Plus, you need more injection wells to help give you the energy to get that oil to your producing wells. So that's why you can see almost 75% of our UIC wells are actually in eastern Kansas. And then lastly, District 4, there are 19 counties in northwest Kansas. Again, oil is the primary resource here. In terms of our agency budget or our division budget for fiscal year 21, we have 9.98 million budgeted, and going forward, there are slight, I think, inflation-related increases, but we are funded, I say almost entirely by fees. I'll explain what I mean by almost entirely, but our main source of revenue comes from a mill on production. I have what they are per barrel of oil and per MCF of gas. In 2018, we had to raise these in part because of a decline in production. I think everybody recalls what happened after 2015 with oil and gas, but then it was coupled with a $3 million sweep of our conservation fee fund, and also some action related to abandoned well funding. We do have fees for licenses, our underground injection control applications, well plugging fee, and then the Surface Owner Notification Act we have 3 forms that operators are required to notify the surface owner before or when they file those forms. And if operators don't do it, we are required by law to do it for them. It just costs them $30 to do it. So it is a source of revenue for us in that sense. And when I said almost entirely before, I was referring to this. We do have a grant from the EPA for our Class 2 program, for the UIC program. It's about $300,000 a year. Doesn't really change much. But then this year, also unique, is we have applied for and received a multi-purpose grant where we are specifically working with KDHE and computer developers to develop a seismicity and injection well tool that will enable us to react much quicker and have all of the information in one spot instead of having to have to go pull seismicity data from KGS or requesting it from KGS. We'll be able to have it all right there in front of us when we want to, either when we want to permit a well or when we need to respond if there's an earthquake. Historical site remediation is something that when I mentioned 74-623 giving us the exclusive jurisdiction over oil and gas activities, one of those activities was this historical site cleanup. It was transferred to us then in 1986. There are currently 47 active sites statewide. The graphic on your left explains what those are. And then the graphic on the right shows the different types of impacts. And if you're good at math, or at least better at math than I am, you can tell that those numbers don't add up. And that's because some of those, some of the sites have multiple impacts. We do have a report that is published on our website, and I have a link here if you are really interested to know more about what's going on there. The types of sites are varied. They can be from just monitoring wells and going out and checking them on an annual basis to measure changes in the fluid, to active recovery and disposal type operations. Abandoned wells is probably what I'm going to talk about the most, in part because it's extremely timely given legislation that we have that has passed before you already, I guess, at this time. But this graphic is from our abandoned well plugging report. What you can see is that at the time of this report, since the abandoned well plugging funds were created in 1996, we've plugged at least 10,718 wells. There are still 5,632 abandoned well records in our abandoned well database, and there will be more abandoned wells. But as you look on the left of this graphic, you can see how the abandoned wells are broken out by district, and you can see there are priority 1 and priority 2. An important thing to note about priority 1 wells is that there are subcategories, and the first are the immediacy level of the threat, A, B, or C. A 1A well is the most immediate threat. Within those categories, there are even further subcategories to determine whether or not the threat is to groundwater, surface water, or public safety. In our report, you can see how those are broken out by county throughout the state. And of course, the priority is set by our supervising geologists for those districts. And our goal is to plug as many of the 1As as possible as they come up. I mentioned the 2 funds. That's the current structure that we've used to plug these wells. And The first fund is what I refer to as the legacy fund. It's for wells that were drilled prior to July 1, 1996. It gets its main source of revenue in a transfer from the conservation fee fund. Prior to 2015, that was $400,000 a year. In 2015, that was changed to $800,000 a year. We also get a $500,000 transfer from the Well Plugging Assurance Fund, which is the other plugging fund each year, and then half of Kansas's royalty on production from federal lands within Kansas. And it might not even be federal lands. The land might be owned privately, but the minerals were held federally from a long time ago. I mentioned the assurance fund. The assurance fund gets its revenue from our licensing process, and there's a cash option that operators can choose instead of having a bond or a letter of credit, and that money goes straight into the Abandoned Well Plugging Insurance Fund. And then the way we plugged wells historically was based on contracts, and the contracts would range from 3 to 5 years, and they would be based on the location of the wells within the district and or the depth of the wells within the district. And they were separated by price. There were under $30,000 projects and over $30,000 projects. And we had these separate contracts for each of the district. Historically, we had 3 contracts in districts in all of the districts. So we had 3 contractors who were available to plug wells in each of the districts. And there was some overlap where we might have had one contractor who was on contract in multiple districts and could plug wells for us. So that brings me to why we brought House Bill 2022 forward. And really, these two wells are some of the main driving forces. What you see on the left is actually a well that was drilled in 1905. It is cased with wooden casing. There's no metal here. We found it because when we were plugging this lease, we were using our metal detectors and unable to locate it. And one of our contractors on site said, well, there's a big flat rock over there. Let me move it, see what's under it. And there it was. This lease is actually the M.A. Alexander lease and was the basis of litigation in front of the commission under the current version of 55-179. And that case started in June of 2011. And by the time all of the judicial review had occurred and the Supreme Court issued its denial of the petition for review, over 4 years had passed. And that's a long time to go with uncertainty regarding something as important as our abandoned well plugging statute. So that was part of the impetus behind House Bill 2022, was to try and clarify who is responsible for plugging abandoned wells and make it so that we can avoid litigation. I like to joke that, being an attorney, litigation doesn't bother me, but as a regulator, it bothers me that it takes 4 years to get something done. So that's why House Bill 2022 and its clarification was necessary. And then if you look on the well on the right, that is the Fawcett well. That is just south of Hayes. When this well came up, we called our contractors and none of the 3 contractors would plug it. So we had to go get it sole source to get it plugged in. I think anybody who's ever gone through sole source knows that's not the preferred way of doing business. So we circled back with our contractors to figure out what we could do to change to get them to plug the wells. And essentially 2 of them told us, you have to pay us more. We don't like our contracts. Things have changed dramatically since we signed them, and we can't plug a well for you without losing money. So what we did is we canceled the contracts for all 3 of those those contractors. We put it back out for bid, and we had 1 contractor bid. And that contractor is a very good contractor, but they were also on contract in 2 other districts. So we knew we weren't going to be able to utilize them as quickly as we wanted to. So we started a series of meetings across the state in each one of the districts where we met with anybody who is licensed to plug wells. And we wanted to know what the problems were, why they weren't plugging wells for the state, why they were not interested in it. And we heard 2 reasons. The number 1 reason was that the process of being approved to be a vendor on state contract is daunting, and they're not wrong. It's a long packet of information you have to fill out. So at these meetings, we walked them through the entire packet and said, this is the type of information that you need to put here. Make sure you check here and sign here, those kinds of things. And then the other was that our model that we used for billing was not similar to how they bill the industry. So therefore, there were things that we didn't account for that because it wasn't in the contract originally, they would have to eat that cost whenever they plugged a well for us. So we made changes to the process. We worked with Department of Administration, and now we have certain agreed to prices for the major things like their pulling units or their rigs. And then there are variable costs that they bid each time we have a project. So when we have a project, an email goes out to everyone who is a qualified vendor. They have a certain amount of time to ask questions. We have a deadline to provide answers to all those questions to all the vendors. And then they have a deadline to get us their final bid. And this new process also gives us flexibility to work outside of just going with the lowest cost, because the lowest cost is generally who we would choose. But if we are in a situation and we say, okay, well, this vendor, you already have 3 projects and you haven't started on any of them, but we have a vendor who's going to charge us $1,000 more, who can start tomorrow, we're going to go with that vendor. That getting that well plugged sooner is worth paying a little extra. So now that we've gone through that process, and we've got this task order system in place for the entire state, we only have 4 contracts statewide, but we were able to go from 0 plugging vendors in District 4 to 6. We went from 3 in District 1 to 7. Same in District 3, we went from 3 to, or District 2, we went from 3 to 7. And in District 3, we went from 3 to 11. So we now have a lot more opportunity to get wells plugged, and we have more people willing to do that. And that is in part why House Bill 2022 is also important, because combining the funds gives us access to some more of those resources. I was remiss when I mentioned the assurance fund, in that it has only been used 2 or 3 times in its history since 1996. So having access to those funds is extremely important to us. And based on this new process for fiscal year 2021, we have 3 projects, or I'm sorry, we have 298 wells and roughly $3.01 million encumbered for plugging wells this fiscal year that began July 1. We still have 3 projects that are out for bid that will add to that. And that's going to take our balance in the abandoned well, the legacy fund, down to below $2 million. So what we're finding is that we can really utilize this new system to get wells plugged. And it's not just that we're plugging wells to have numbers plugged, we're plugging higher priority wells and taking care of these problems. So I think in terms of why that's important to water, it's fairly obvious to me that plugging abandoned wells is preventing possible pollution issues. So having said that, I believe that's the last of my slides. So if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer any.
Mr. Harden, do we have questions from the committee? Representative Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would very much appreciate it if we could go back to page 19 and the 3rd bullet point, which has to do with seismicity. And it's stated pretty clearly, but I would appreciate it if you could amplify that just a bit more. For instance, how are there private seismicity records?
Sure. What I'm talking about in slide 19 is that there is a consortium of Class 1 well operators who work with KGS to establish further seismic monitoring. And those seismic monitors, that data is owned by that consortium, by those private entities. So it's not necessarily public like what you would find from the KGS monitors. And that data is shared, I think, fairly routinely through presentations, but it's not like you can just go onto their website and access it. And that was one of the things that the Groundwater Protection Council was recommending, is that that data should be more available, and that we should figure out a way to make it more available. And if that meant confidentiality agreements, then that's what we should do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any further questions? I see Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question has to do with, the cost of drilling or plugging these wells. You had a break there of different costs. Is that also related to the amount of time that contractor is on site it takes for them to fill that up? Or is that more based on depth, based on time on site, based on how hard it is to access that well? How is that determined? Thank you.
Sure. Generally, it's all of the above. Really, primarily, if in a perfect world, that would be based just on depth. But the issue is the wells that we're plugging are not wells that are in pristine condition. So oftentimes we run into downhole issues that may require us to use specialty tools. So the cost is based on what we find when we start plugging the well.
Did I get it? Representative
Yes,
Vaughn.
thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. In addition to the plugging, testing, and construction of wells under your protection of usable water mandate, you also talked about the establishment of sensitive groundwater areas. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that and what the criteria are for those areas.
The criteria as it applies to us is that if you want to have a pit associated with a well in a sensitive groundwater area, it's likely going to have to be located outside of that sensitive groundwater area, or it's going to have to be an above ground still pit, so that there is no material going into the ground. Because what we find there is that you dig a pit, you're going to dig down into where you can hit usable water. So the actual sensitive groundwater areas were established prior to my time with the commission through the advisory committee. But we have a map on our website that shows where they are. If you would like me to send that to you, I can do that.
Yeah, I would be interested in that. And a quick follow-up, if I may. Please. So you said that the advisory council established those. Is there an ongoing review process for identifying new areas, or is that pretty set in stone?
It's fairly set in stone because I think, as I showed on that graphic, and I don't want to say set in stone because I don't want to give the impression that we wouldn't ever amend them based on reason to do that. But we would have to, I think, find something that would indicate that we needed to add areas. But there are, just because it's not in a sensitive groundwater area on our map doesn't mean we won't have those further requirements. Like I said, if it looks like it's even close, that's why we will have our field staff go out and look. Because you also wouldn't want somebody to put a pit, might be outside of a river valley, but it would be at the top of a hill. You wouldn't want it to be there where it could leak down into the valley. So there are other considerations that our field staff take into account.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Hoffman. I appreciate that very much. My question is, though, on an existing lease and there are abandoned wells on that lease, as well as productive wells. Who pays for that? How can you get those abandoned wells plugged and all then?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to 55-179. Is there a responsible party for those wells? If the operator who's on the lease, producing the lease, is responsible for those, what we would do is we would verify that they are in compliance with our regulations in terms of temporary abandonment. There's a process where an operator can forego operations on a well by filing a form with us and tracking the fluid level in the well to make sure that it doesn't present a pollution threat. They can do that up to 10 years, and then they have to file for an exception with the commission. If that's not the case, if they are not the responsibility of that operator, you would call the district office, ask them to come do an inspection. They could then prioritize those wells for plugging using state funds. And I would note that in House Bill 2022, one of the provisions is we are required to come up with a program to reimburse persons who plug wells who are not responsible for them. So in a situation like that, if you had wells on your property that were not where the responsible party was gone, but you wanted to get them plugged, the vision is that we will have regulations that will tell you how you can apply for reimbursement before you plug them, but then hire a plugging contractor to do it and then get reimbursed using those plugging funds. And again, that process hasn't been started yet. That's going to take regulations. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Haswood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, when you said that you're hiring the companies to plug the well, are these Kansan-owned companies? And is that insured in the process of it?
For the most part, they are. I mean, we may have companies that are, if they're, close to a border, they may be licensed to do business in Colorado and Kansas or Oklahoma and Kansas. But I don't think that plays into our thought. Our thought was we just wanted qualified contractors who are willing to come plug wells.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman.
Representative Vaughn for a second time.
Sorry, one more question. It was in regards to the peer review that you mentioned and the financial assurance program. When we combine the funds through the new legislation that we passed, does that create a sustainable assurance program for you, or is there more that you'd like to do in terms of the bonds that are mentioned and the future of the program as well? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, and that's a great question and observation, and the answer is no. That doesn't take care of the funding problem going forward, and that is our next step. That is why we need to look at the assurance, and that is the plan. Is we will be increasing it, but I don't think that necessarily just increasing the bonds or the insurance amounts is going to solve the problem. That there are likely going to be other sources of revenue that we will need to look at.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. One of the reasons why we didn't include an assurance package with this is because of all the changes that were going on with our processes. We didn't really know how much money we needed. And I didn't want to come forward and say, well, we need $5 million a year. Let's raise $5 million a year when we could only spend $2 million. We want to make sure that we're being responsible about where we set those amounts.
Sure. That's great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I see no further questions, but I do have, you mentioned early on in your funding, and then you said there was other funding sources, and then we got down into it. We talked about some funding here and there. If you would flesh that out for us, I'd appreciate that. And
funding for the division or for?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the two main sources are the mills on production, by far and away the largest amount. Then we get roughly $500,000 a year from the licensing fees. There's $100 per license fee. We have a plugging fee for wells, which is I think it's 35 cents per foot, not to be less than $35 per well. And that's a legacy fee, a historical one that basically comes from the fact that we used to have our field staff used to be known as well pluggers. They would witness well plugging, so there was a fee charged to the industry for every well that was plugged to account for our time. We have an application fee for injection wells that ranges depending on if it's a new application or an amendment. And then I mentioned the Surface Owner Notification Act fee, which is $30 when an operator chooses not to notify the surface owner, and we have to do that. And then I mentioned the UIC grant was the other source of funding, and that's over $300,000 a year.
Okay, sir, if you would just put those down and send them to my assistant so that everybody could have that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
And with that, we thank you very much for the information, and we do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you.
Next on our list today is we are going to work a bill, which means we have to have a little bit of a conversation before we do that. Because of the nature of how we're doing business nowadays, we have to talk about amendments and we have to talk about how we're going to vote. So for amendments, we live in an electronic world, and unfortunately, in the past, we always handed out the amendments when they were called for in the committee. We're not going to do that anymore. I visited with the revisers this morning. How it will be done is if, let's say, Representative Newland had an amendment for a bill that's come up for discussion. He'll be recognized and say, he says, I have an amendment. At that point, the reviser who did the amendment for him will send that amendment to the committee assistant, who will then send that out to each of you. While that sending is going on, the reviser will put it on the screen, share his screen, and go through the amendment. You will, by that time, have it in your system if you want to follow along that way. And at that point, then, after the reviser's gone through it, then we'll go back to the representative to explain the amendment, and then they will be open for questions at that point and discussion. That will be the amendment process. Now for the voting, either on the bill or on the amendments. I visited with the revisers once again, and by rule, House rules, we are not required to record votes in committees. And that's, unless there's a rule change, that's the way it is. Now, that does not mean that, like on the House floor, you can't call for a division or a roll call vote. That still applies in the committee. So what we'll do is when it comes time to vote, I'll ask for people to raise their hands. And it'll be on the screen that you and I can see that we all have the ability to raise the hand here. Now, if for some reason you are not able to do that, I will ask that you at least have your video on so that I can see you and you raise your hand at that point. And then the vice chair and the minority leader here will help me count those hands. And then at that point, I'll get that information, and then I will say, we will have either passes or fails at that point. Now, I will pause then, and everybody will have the opportunity to call for division or roll call. And after the vote, I will always ask if you wish to have your vote recorded. And that is your privilege, to have your vote recorded in the minutes, which will then at that point be public for everybody to see. If it's a division or roll call, those will be public as well. Those will be recorded. Is that clear? Any questions on either the amendment process or the voting process? Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. An instance that has come up a couple times in my short career here is having a conceptual amendment where just because we haven't had time to visit with a reviser, it comes up during that day. Will there be any flexibility for that kind of conceptual amendment? Thank you.
Generally speaking, I don't recognize conceptual amendments. There are exceptions, though. We get in the heat of the battle and all of a sudden we see there's been a minor mistake in a bill or something and that could be changed easily. And I'll work with the revisers and we could maybe do that, but if it's going to be a big amendment, probably not. That's something that needs to be thought through and worked out before you come into the committee. That's why we always have a bill hearing and then we have a delay for several days until we actually vote on the bill to give you that time to do that. And the revisers are very good. I mean, they're quick, they're good, easy to work with, so that should not be a problem. Any other questions? Now, Representative Bishop.
Thank you, sir. I want to clarify the voting process. we'll be counting votes based on whether someone has their video turned on and is raising a hand. Or you use the little happy face thingy and go up to raise hand and put that on the screen.
Yes.
So, okay, so we'll be doing both ways. I just wanted to clarify that, because that's.
We want everybody to have the ability to vote whatever method.
Thank you.
We'll use whatever we have to so that we can get everybody counted. It is, but you have to realize you raise your hand in this room, you are being videoed throughout the state and the world. Okay.
Sir, however, not, the whole room is not always on. Like right now, you and I are on the screen, and if we're raising our hands, that's seen. But we don't have the view of the
Right,
rest of the room.
right. So generally speaking, they won't be seen. This is all instead of a voice vote, because voice votes, because everybody's out there, just is not going to work. Go ahead.
I would like to suggest that everybody use the raise hand function. It'll just be clear, it'll stay on there until you take it down.
And I think most people are going to do that. Any other questions on either amendment process or voting? Okay, with that. Welcome, sir. We have on the agenda next will be discussion and action on House Bill 2005. What is the will of the committee? Representative Orr.
Mr. Chair, I'm in strong favor of that. I see it both as reducing government and eliminating some red tape. So I would like to make a motion, and I move that the committee recommend House Bill 2005 favorable for passage.
Thank you, sir. Do I have a second? And I see a second from Representative Riley. So it's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Are there amendments? I see neither hands on the screen or in the room for amendments or discussion. Who has a hand? With that, then, yeah, he's made a mistake. We'll take care of that up here. Seeing no further discussion or amendments, Representative Orr, would you close, please? Thank you. The motion has been made, seconded, and closed. We are now to the point of voting on this bill, House Bill 2005. All those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Thank you. All those opposed, please raise your hand. This bill passed unanimously, will be recommended to the floor. With that, committee, thank you very much. We had an excellent meeting this morning with our leadership group and the revisers and the research staff. And the vice chair has reminded me that I went through a process of what my thinking of where this committee is going. And he said he would like for me to share that with the committee. So I think Thursday I will go over my vision for this committee, both this year and next. And that way, everybody will kind of know where we're headed. And with that, we are adjourned.